folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Bahrain Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, as always, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So we're going to get straight into my key deadline considerations for this week. All the team selection dilemmas, lineup considerations, transfer thoughts, etc. that we haven't covered really already in my team selection video or have alluded to it but not gone into detail quite as much. First thing I want to talk about, which I already probably did elaborate on a little bit in my team selection video, was the different lineup combinations we're thinking about heading into Bahrain. I think this is probably the first week of the season where there's a clear template convergence after the first 3 or 4 races. We've obviously got the 3 race average booked in now that we've done 3 races, and as we're seeing, a lot of the DNFs from Australia are falling off, particularly budget drivers, those rookie drivers that crashed out in the wet in Albert Park. I think what this means as well, that especially because we're seeing 2 drivers, Bortoleto and Hadjar, bottom out at 4.5 million, and Mercedes and McLaren becoming a popular constructor duo to pair. A lot of people are moving in that direction for this weekend because of obviously the points on offer with 2 premium constructors. Now, I think the biggest conundrum a lot of us have thought about, are still kind of discussing when that optimal time is to rejig our teams and our focus of budget versus points is one such dilemma a lot of us are thinking about as to whether or not we continue to roll with a B tier constructor with that price gain upside like Haas or VCarb, or do we pivot into a Mercedes constructor lineup with a Bortoleto or a Jack Doohan, for example. And I think right now there is, and I'm gonna be completely honest, there is no one correct way to play F1 fantasy, but I will say the majority of the discussion is certainly centered around, at least this week, around that Mercedes Doohan / Bortoleto lineup. I think the reason is because we're now starting to see, if we take Japan as an example, people that went with McLaren and Mercedes versus McLaren and Haas, the McLaren Mercedes lineups, probably got up about 40 or 50 extra points. Are we really going to justify an extra 0.3 million in budget gain for those points? I mean, I don't necessarily think that's a wrong approach or a wrong point of view to have, but I did want to obviously kind of draw our attention towards specifically these early simulations for Bahrain on f1fantasytools.com. Now, I think for the purpose of this example, I do want to focus on the McLaren Mercedes or the McLaren Haas or / VCarb builds. What this means for points on the left-hand side here, and price, and then points and budget gain as well. And I've forced to include McLaren and Mercedes in this lineup. I think McLaren, Mercedes, Piastri are going to be very popular. The distinction of the other drivers probably up in the air as to what direction you want to go for. I've, in this instance, excluded all drivers that are more or less going to go down in price that aren't template picks, left the likes of Hulkenberg, Stroll, etc. in, but only really force included the constructors at the moment. So you can see here, on a budget of 104, I think most people are probably between 102 and 104, 105 at the moment. You can get to this lineup at 103.5. I think that's going to be the template pick. At least one of these 2 combinations will be the template pick. And with that, you can get approximately 190 odd points at a 2.4. Let's use the Doohan lineup. 192 points at 2.4 million cost cap gain in Bahrain. So we're going to go 192, 2.4. If I was to exclude Mercedes and include Haas, that would give us, most people would probably have Russell or Antonelli in this second driver slot. That would give us 174 at 2.4. So it's clearly a 20-point distinction between these 2 teams, more or less, assuming the framework stays in place for these guys. McLaren, Piastri, Ocon, Doohan, Hadjar. Obviously, instead of Behrman, there's Russell, and instead of Mercedes, there's Haas. So we're working with 174 for 2.4 as opposed to the 194 for 2.4 on the previous lineups construction. So I think for me, that's enough to convince me early doors that I'm very much leaning towards Mercedes, but I don't think it is an absolute must do. As I say, I stress play your own game as much as possible. And obviously when you take into account hits and chip usage, then I think maybe, which we'll talk about in just a second, maybe there's a discussion there as to whether or not moving towards a Mercedes McLaren lineup, if you're taking -20s, 30s, etc., is another conversation altogether. So speaking of one of the drivers in the team that we just had on screen, Jack Doohan, there's a lot of talk now because we're getting closer to this 5-race tenure of him with Alpine, that he may be at risk of losing his seat in Miami. There was a lot of reports, a lot of outlets indicating that Doohan was on a 5-race contract with Alpine for this season that would take him through until the end of Saudi Arabia, which is the race after Bahrain. And then we've obviously got the sprint in Miami. The reason I think there is maybe an indication that Colapinto could get that seat over Jack Doohan then is the Latin American influence in North America. And there hasn't really been too much news just yet on Franco Colapinto, but the fact that Doohan hasn't had the best start to the season, Alpine haven't actually been that good at all. He obviously crashed out in free practice in Japan and then had the DNF in Australia as well. Jack's obviously at odds to continue through and beyond Miami. Now, I'm not saying this is an absolute lock, and as an Australian myself, I would absolutely hate to see him lose his seat in Formula One, but the omens are not good for him, to be honest. And so naturally, even though Jack is on track for a likely price gain because his points threshold for the maximum price rise in Bahrain is only 3 points, I'm thinking about whether or not having him in my team, bringing him into my team in Bahrain is the right decision this week. And I think it very much boils down to transfer flexibility and that stuff. For me personally, transfers at the moment feel like a bit of a premium. I'm taking a hit most likely this week. I used all 3 of my transfers last week, and I'm seeing a lot of people thinking about taking -20s as well. So having transfer flexibility in future weeks, particularly as we get close to the sprint, and for those of you that have already used your wildcard, I think is very much something to think about. I, for one, think going down that Doohan route probably books in a transfer close to Miami or after that weekend. Bortoleto, on the other hand, doesn't have the same price gain upside, but naturally at 4.5 million, he's not going to drop. You probably wouldn't need to trade him out. Obviously, budget drivers come with a higher DNF risk, but I do think Bortoleto is someone I can just stick in there at 4.5. Won't have to worry about the extra cost cap he might soak up if I'm looking for an upgrade somewhere else. So just something to think about. I don't think Doohan's a bad option for this week, but obviously trying to think 1 or 2 races ahead what that could mean for our fantasy teams. On the wildcard and taking hits this week, a lot of people are very much entertaining the idea of at the very least a -10. I, for one, will very much be in that same camp as I've talked about to get in Mercedes if I choose to go down that route at the deadline. I think a lot of people have either used their wildcard in China or are probably thinking about using it around the Limitless weekend in Miami. If that's an approach, I may not even choose to use Limitless in Miami, but that's a conversation for another time. But I do think taking a -10 for this week is going to be perfectly fine. I think just with how the pricing model is structured this season and the approach we are taking to chase value or preserve value in our fantasy teams, hits are not going to be that uncommon compared to the years prior. So I think a -10 is perfectly fine. I wouldn't burn the wild card if you haven't used it. If you're only looking at a -10. -20 on the other hand, I think it's a bit more of a discussion as to whether or not you think it's worthwhile. I don't think it's necessarily wrong or right, but at the same time, -20 is not a small amount of points. And we saw on the screen before, I'll just bring it back up for you guys. I've got my budget builder up on the screen here, so that's not the one I wanted to show you, but the team calculator. So we had obviously on the screen before McLaren, Haas, Piastri. This team, the top team, if we just use that as an example, 174 points at 2.4. If I force in Mercedes here, we had 192, 194 at 2.4. So it's about 20 points. That is where I'm thinking, is taking a -20 worth it or not? I think it's very team dependent. I'm not going to say it's an objectively right or wrong outcome. And I know you're probably thinking, Rob, why are you fence sitting at the moment? Well, I mean, I hate to fence sit, but I think it's one of those situations where every team is going to be different. Every strategy is going to be different. If you think the -20 can pay itself off over a couple of weeks, then absolutely. But I wouldn't be taking a -20 for a driver or a constructor if you're planning to move them out the following week for Saudi or Limitless or whatever the approach or strategy might be. So just think about that. I think, again, as I said, it's going to be tough to say it's definitely right or wrong, but the fact that it is, and in the simulations on Fantasy Tools, very close for that 20 points for going from pure budget to pure points, or kind of kind of along those lines, I think it's certainly food for thought. Just quickly on budget building as well, I won't go into detail too much on that, but it is going to be something that applies all throughout the year. People have been asking, when is the right time to build budget? When is the right time to stop and focus on points? I think there's going to be an approach or an element of budget building every single week until Abu Dhabi. Sure, there's probably going to be less influence and emphasis on it in the latter stages of the season, but $0.6 million drops are not insignificant. I don't think we can go into a race weekend and completely ignore them. I think there will be plenty of weeks ahead where we have to accept eating the odd $0.6 or $0.2 million price drop just because we don't have the transfers available. But I'm not suggesting this is a juncture where we are suddenly just going to focus all in on points this weekend in Bahrain. I think we probably will start to see more of a mindset shift around or after the summer break is my guess. 10 to 12 races seems about right, but I'm obviously putting a finger in the air. But I think right now, because of the budget drivers, $0.6 million drops are things that I think at this point in the season, people are not going to be kind of just laissez-faire with. So keep that in mind, but I don't think suddenly we're shifting into a fully points-focused mindset at this point of the season. Quickly onto my asset tier rankings for Bahrain. Drivers pretty self-explanatory. I think Oscar, for those of you that held, myself included, in Japan, definitely the right call. One less transfer I obviously needed to worry about. George Russell, for me, I really like as a second option, not just because the price threshold the points threshold isn't too bad. I mean, it is 26 points for a max price rise, but I think it's certainly achievable. He's one of the most consistent and reliable drivers in the A tier this season. And I think the fact that Mercedes actually have demonstrated a lot more performance than I probably expected in the preseason. George, if you can't get to Oscar, is a perfectly fine alternative for your 2X slot. Kimi, Lando, Max, not really on my radar this week, simply because of the fact that either the price thresholds for them are too high, and for someone like Kimi, I think he's looked great so far through 3 races, but he has had the driver of the day and the fastest lap in 2 of them, which have inflated his scores a little bit of late. As soon as those fall off his average, I think his thresholds are going to be much higher. Now that he's also an A tier asset, doesn't quite appeal to me for the same price gain upside that he might have had as a B tier. In the drivers, Hadjar, for me, called it before the deadline last week, and I stand by it. Number 1 priority transfer for most teams this week at 4.5 million, bound to go up 0.6 million if you can at least make it to the end of the race. I think for me, a priority target for a lot of people that own Hulkenberg, so 1-for-1 swap for that is pretty easy. Jack Doohan, Ocon and Behrman, I think, again, popular picks for obvious reasons. I think Bortoletto, the other driver, at 4.5. I like him if you can't reach Jack Doohan, for example, for the reasons that obviously is a set and forget transfer. You don't really need to worry about him because he's not going to drop in price, even though his point scoring upside isn't that great. But last year in Formula 2, known to be a very reliable driver, I think he was tied first for the least number of DNFs of drivers that had raced 20 or more races. So sure, is Australia DNF not a great start to his F1 career, but I think for someone at the back, he's going to be pretty reliable just to get around the track. Hulkenberg, Albon, Sonoda, I probably wouldn't be targeting this week. And then Stroll, for me, kind of a hit and miss. I wouldn't expect him to rise in price at all this week. But if you've got other fires to put out in your team, like Hulkenberg, for example, or maybe an Alonso or a Sainz or someone that's bound to drop in price, then Stroll's perfectly fine for this week. Final team thoughts. We'll go through my team selection in the lead up to the deadline this weekend. I'll have a stream again this week, so we'll unpack all of that then. On Piastri at the moment, don't see that changing at the moment with price changes and all that stuff, but Russell, I think, perfectly fine. If you've got Norris, I have no qualms with holding him for this week. If you don't want to take hits or activate chips, he'll score probably 25 to 35 points. I wouldn't be surprised with that. But I think kind of the money you can use going into Piastri or Russell for other parts of your team certainly kind of makes the argument that Norris at the moment seems a little, let's call it, out of favor in F1 fantasy. On the chip front, Bahrain, known for its overtakes, known for very few DNFs. I wouldn't be using any of the insurance trips. I certainly wouldn't be using the 3X or the Limitless this weekend, but it's going to be dry across the weekend. So hopefully, as I said, no real risk of DNFs. We had 0 DNFs here last year and 3 DNFs the 2 years before that in each race. So hopefully something similar to Japan with a bit more passing and excitement on track. And as I said just before, I've got another stream coming up this weekend. Deadline, as always, is back at qualifying as it was for Japan. So I definitely think if you're around, you want to talk absolute nonsense with me for 2 hours. We talked about fast food, hamburgers, how to interpret a weather map on stream last week. So clearly the F1 fantasy community have their priorities in order right before the team lock deadline, but do drop by if you've got some time this Saturday to talk F1 fantasy with me. So here's my team, as you've probably seen several times already this week: Piastri, Hulk, Stroll, Ocon, Behrman, McLaren and Haas. Most of you guys know by now that Hulkenberg, Stroll and Haas are the most obvious makeways from -10 this week. Only 2 free transfers in the top right, as you can see. And as I've probably talked into existence, into just about I haven't been shoving it down anyone's throat this week. Again, I think that's subjective, of course, but this is probably where my head is at, where most people are thinking about. And as I suggested, if you're a bit short on cost cap, then Bortoletto is a perfectly fine alternative to drop in here at 4.5. Neither of these two drivers, him and Hadjar, are going to drop any further at the 4.5 million price floor. I want to go through one other lineup, obviously, that we talked about already in for this week. The Haas lineup, or the VCARB lineup. You can throw in any one of VCARB or Haas here, and then bringing back in, where the heck did he go? Ocon, Hadjar, and then 21.5. I think I'm just short, but you could obviously do George Russell here in this slot. I think if you've got VCARB, some teams might actually be able to get to something like, it doesn't matter, VCARB, Haas, everyone's budget is different. Some teams might be able to get to something like this. I really like that for this week if you're choosing not to go down the Piastri, McLaren, Mercedes route. But as I said, if we look at over on the team calculator, Russell, let's see, what's Russell's estimate? He's expected to score 23 plus Haas's 10. So 33 for Russell and Haas. 33 for Russell and Haas plays 48. 48 plus 2. Was it? 48 plus 1. So 49. So 33 for Russell and Haas plays 49 for Doohan and Mercedes. Another reason why, if we go back to the fantasy teams, why I'm liking the McLaren Mercedes as opposed to the VCARB. But anyway, guys, that's kind of it. I know it's very much condensed into 20 minutes, but I'm not trying to go over time too much because I know short, sharp, and snappy is the name of the game in F1 Fantasy. But I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with a deadline stream this race weekend, as always, and let me know down in the comments below if you've got any alternatives on your team selection lineup this week. But have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all very soon.